Good afternoon and welcome to Lesson 19. This week we are teaching our children about God and time, which is a very, very interesting subject, and there's actually a lot we could go into on that. So let's remind ourselves that we're teaching children. However, for your own personal study, it's a very interesting topic to explore, and it can help us to understand God better and to be comforted and trust Him more, and there's a lot that can go with that. But this week we want to talk to our children about God and time. And the reason why I put this in there in our lesson plan and the schedule and the book and whatnot is because I do believe that if we can have a stronger understanding of God, then obviously we'll know Him more. We'll be able to trust Him more because we understand His power, right? And His authority and His ability and all these other things. The more we know God, the more we know Him personally, and the more we know of Him, the better it is. And so it's a topic that can have some weight, but really at its foundation, I think it actually is quite simple. Lots of people have difficulty understanding God and His relationship with time. And the main reason I think that we have difficulty with that is because we are creatures that are in time and we are bound by time, as is all of creation. And so with God being outside of time, He makes Himself different from, well, He doesn't make Himself, but He is different from creation in that way and in other ways. But in one of those ways, so since we don't have it in common, it makes it harder for us to understand it. But I think we can understand it to a level. And I think that we can and should teach our children about it. So we're going to talk about God and His relationship with time. And so I use a number of examples in my teaching. Maybe you remember some of them. Maybe you're familiar with some of them. This morning in church and in the video that went out this morning for the Sunday teaching, we talked about this a little bit, about God and time. And one of the examples that I like to use is the idea of a map. Now, if you use your phone, that's one thing, but if you can think back to a paper map, or maybe you can open up on Google Maps and you can, with your child, say, hey, let's pretend to plan a trip. And let's say we were going to go to Niagara Falls. And so you click on Niagara Falls and, directions from here. And you're like, all right, well, we would gas up here. So you have your starting point, and we would gas up here, and then we might stop here to see something. We'd stop here to eat supper. Maybe we'd sleep at this hotel. We might stop in and visit some friends that we have in this town, and then we would arrive at our destination. And so while they can look at that from the outside and picture how things are going to happen, that's similar to God and time. Whereas we are stuck in a moment and we look back at the past, which is behind us, and we can't go back to it, we can't affect it, we can't change it. And we look forward to a future that really we can guess at things, but we can't be certain about what that will look like on our own understanding. And we're in the middle, in the present, and we're moving through it, right? It's different from looking at a map and then being on the road as you move across the map, as it were. And so God is outside of time. Now, He interacts in time, but He's not bound to it as we are. So where it's a map, you can picture Him being able to put His hand into the map, move things, change things, do what He needs to do, and then pull out of it, but He's able to see it all at once. And so where we look at something that seems so long ago, He can see it right now, and we look at the future and it's uncertainty, but to Him it's almost stationary in a way, and He can see it all and understand it all and interact with it. And so one of the beautiful things about this, and we can look at the prophecies and we can be comforted because God has a number of prophecies, a number of promises, a number of things that He says in His Word. And if they are true, then they're very comforting. Where he says about, when we enter into the kingdom of heaven and the new earth is there and heaven comes down on it, and that every tear will be wiped away, that their death will be no more. That's a very comforting thought. Now, if I was simply to say that, down the road, I'm gonna make sure that you're in no pain and everything's gonna be good and you're not gonna have any problems. Well, what power do I have? What authority do I have? And how can I really say what's going to happen? But God, being outside of time, he's not talking about a future event. He sees it now, right, in a way. Whereas we look at it as the future. And one of the reasons we can see and trust this is because we can see the track record of God. We can look at the Old Testament prophecies, which have come to pass, the ones that Jesus fulfilled and other ones. We can look at Jesus himself while he was here on earth a number of times, and I listed some in the book, in the lesson plan there. But for example, would be in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. But he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man." So there's that happening, and Jesus did this a number of times where he said, "I'm going to die." And not like I can say I'm going to die and that's most likely going to happen unless Jesus returns before my death. But he said, "I'm going to die. I'm going to be crucified. They're going to reject me, and then I'm going to rise again." And he said that quite often, and it happened. Or in Mark 13, verse 1, "And as he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said, 'Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.' And Jesus said, 'Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left on here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" So he's saying the temple is going to be destroyed. That's a very, very strong statement. And in 70 AD, after the death of Christ, the temple was destroyed. Right? And there's, then he talks about signs of the end of the age in Luke 9:13. That's not 13. 21. He foretells his death again. He says that he's going to die again. In Luke 17, verse 20 onward, he talks about the coming kingdom and what that's going to look like. So some of these prophecies have been fulfilled, and some of them we're waiting and anticipating them to be fulfilled going ahead. Luke 18, verse 31, he tells about his death again, that this is going to take place. And then Luke 21, verse 5, he foretells the destruction of the temple again. Or at the same time, but it's recorded in Luke instead of Mark. But there's a number of times where he does this, and he says that this thing is going to happen. And then it does happen because he knows. He has that knowledge. It's a wonderful thing. You can also look at the Old Testament, the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled and other prophets of the Old Testament who spoke about wars and other events that did come to pass. And so we can see that God is outside of time, knows what is going to happen, speaks through his people, and then those things do happen. And so one of the comforts we can take in that, as I said, is that there's a lot of unreliable sources of information in our world. You check the weather network and it says it's going to be sunny all weekend, and so you go on some trip and it rains. How many times has that happened to us? Or you budget for something and then the price fluctuates or changes, or it's very difficult to plan. We can say, even the Bible says this, right? That it's foolish to say, we're going to do this and we're going to do this and then we'll move to this town and we'll do that work. Instead, we should say, if the Lord wills, because it's very difficult to actually make long-term plans because the variables change, things change. We can't really say what's going to happen for sure, but God can. And so when he says that, we will be with him in paradise, that those who are in him, will be in heaven, that every tear will be wiped away, that we will be comforted, that will be in his presence, death will be no more, and that we should be able to go through the difficult times that we go through now, because we can look to the future and say, although I struggle now, I know the end result is worth it. To be able to say that with confidence is in part because God knows what he's talking about. He's not an unreliable source. He is the most reliable source. I got a little family devotional here for you to do. And I think the first activity part there is a really good idea, is to go outside with your family, go sit in a bench in a park or go to the mall and just let you and your children guess on what things are going to happen. A bird lands on a branch. What do you think the bird's going to do next? Is it going to hop to the ground? Is it going to fly away? Is it going to go to another branch? Is it going to eat some bugs? And guess. And then keep a tally of how many guesses actually came to be. What driveway or what road is that car going to turn onto, or what's that person going to do, or whatever, just little playful things. And you can see how difficult it can be to actually guess really simple things about the future. But when we look at what God has said, we can see that He is true and He is good, and we can trust His prophecy. And so I say the phrase, if He was true then, or if He was with me then, He is with me now. And if He was true then, He's true now. And so God said that the temple was going to be destroyed. And it was. God said that a virgin will conceive and give birth, and she did. God said that the Israelites would win this war, and they did. God said that they would be held in captivity for this period of time, and then they were freed, and they did. And he says that he will come again, and he will. And he says that he will gather those who are in him and wipe away every tear, and we will be counted righteous in his sight, and we will. And those things will happen. And so we can have that wonderful thing. And so as a family, to take time and to pray to God and to thank Him for who He is, and asking Him to help us to trust Him and to remember that He is good and trustworthy. It's a very foundational level. Now, in your own study, you could do a lot more. You could go and you could look at Molinism, which I'm a fan of, I agree with, and you could look at the best of all possible worlds and see how God understands free will and the intricacies of man and is able to plan the world where the most amount of people would freely choose to follow Him. That's really interesting. Really cool subject, and I think it helps us to see the character of God and to understand the suffering, but also the goodness of God, and to be able to balance that out. I'm not saying you should try to walk your child through that. That's probably too advanced at this point. But for your own study, that's a good thing to study. And to go through and look at the various prophecies of the Old Testament, to look at the prophecies that Jesus said of the things that would come, and the prophecies from the Old Testament that we anticipate coming to pass in the future. And the ones that were fulfilled. It's a very good study to do. But at any rate, we want to keep it somewhat simplistic, somewhat foundational for our children this week, and let them walk through that. We started a new memory verse last week. I found we were trying to do Psalm chapter 8, I think it was. And I think it was too big of a chunk, and we had, the holidays and other things that were happening. And so it wasn't happening. So we will go back to doing bigger chunks, of course. It's a good thing to do. But for right now, we're going to focus on Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So that's it. That's the verse. Last week, I filled up a duffel bag with books and other stuff, and I used that as an example to show them what heavy laden means. I had them all run a race, and then the kid that was the fastest, we had the race again, but he had to have the bag, and he couldn't even move the thing. And then I came over, took it, and I gave him a light bag and talked about the exchanging of burdens there and how God gives us rest and what rest is. And so just for our own sake, and something that I did tell to them, is there's difference between rest and laziness. Rest requires that work was done previous to it, right? If you're just always resting, you're actually just being lazy, and that's not what we want. But that we come to God and we can find rest in Him. We can find comfort in Him. So go through that verse with your child. I sent them home with a printout that was prettier. It wasn't just like the words, but it was a nice little animation behind it. Design, but picture behind it. If your child wasn't here last Sunday and you want a copy of that, just let me know and I'll print one off for you. But let's do that study, and as we go through it, if you have any questions at all, reach out to me and I will help you as best as I can. Hope you have a great week. Hope you honor God in all that you do as you teach your children the ways of the Lord.